be seated. I have to talk to you about a couple things right at the outset. I have to use an inappropriate word. S-N-O-W.
Finally, it's here. On the radio.
So our foul weather policy really is what go ahead.
We practice excommunication, don't we? No.
Okay, so what we have is we have a foul weather policy, right? And in the event of SNOW, what I'd like you to do, basically we want to put that responsibility on you. If you don't feel like you can get here safely and home safely, please stay home. One of the reasons we stream on Facebook is so if you can't make it, it's available for you on Facebook. We do record this and it's available on YouTube. And if you're not sure how to get to all those kind of things, get your grandkids to help you. So that's basically our foul weather policy. We would very rarely close the church. You know, if weather was just expected to be very bad during the day, we would just cancel. So, and the way that we would advertise that is through Facebook and phone calls and whatnot. So, if you have questions, of course, you can see Melissa, because she's the glue that holds this place together. Shop at the Cop is coming up. Catch her on a bad day, she's the crazy glue that holds this place together. And she knows that I say that. She won't get mad at me. She'll get mad at me. So, what are we doing again? Oh yeah, church. Yeah, SNOW. Shop of the Cop is coming up, and I think, are there any other events coming up that I'm unaware of? There's the December events that we're trying to make sure we get well organized this year. Last year was a little bit of chaos. So. Oh man, let's pray. Maybe corral this chaos by going before the throne. Father, thank you so much for your Son Jesus, Lord. That by his death on the cross, you are our Father, and we are brothers and sisters one of another. What an incredible idea, Lord. And so, Father, as brothers and sisters, as we come before you, as we come to your word, Lord, help us to think deeply and carefully about what you've given us. That we would be quick to recognize when we stray, and that we would be quick to recognize when we misinterpret or misunderstand your word, Lord. Help us to understand it carefully and correctly. And so, Father, we just rejoice in who you are and what you've given us, Lord. And I pray that you help us as a church, Lord, to do your will in Christ's name. One time I was taking a load of boats to Maine. In my former life, I was an over-the-road truck driver. I drove flatbeds mostly. And there are things to enjoy about that. I like this a whole lot better, so thanks for having me. And so this is my truck with a load of boats, is the next slide. And boats are good. Like if you're a flatbed truck driver, there's a lot of heavy, hot, or cold work depending on the season. You're out in the weather all the time throwing tarps and rolling things up. But when you haul boats, somebody puts the boats on the trailer, somebody takes the boats off the trailer. You don't have to tarp them up. You just it's about the easiest flatbed trucking job out there. And so I was hauling a load of boats up to Maine. Now, I picked them up in Missouri, so it was a couple of days of just, driving, cruising behind the wheel. And I was in New York State or Connecticut or somewhere. There was a little bit of traffic. There are people passing me on the right because I was in a company truck. I was doing all of 62 miles an hour. That's as fast as it would go. And so I'm just holding the steering wheel, going 62 miles an hour, being a good, safe driver. And on the shoulder up ahead of me, I noticed a tanker truck had pulled over and turned his flashers on, and so he was stopped. And so with traffic on the left of me and a tanker truck coming up on the right, I thought, okay, I'll cover the brake just in case. What did that guy did? Pulled out. Now, the other thing about boats is that they're expensive and boat customers are picky. So you don't want to scratch the boats. And so I get on the brakes. And I tell you what, all the stuff, like there were bunk beds in the back, and I would keep some of my stuff on the top bunk. I had a bike that I took with me, and it was a folding bike, so my bike starts sliding around, and all the stuff that's up there starts hitting the floor, and I'm just like, oh, that guy. Don't you hate that guy? In that moment, I hated that guy. I didn't want to scratch the boats, and boats are light, so there's not a whole lot of weight to help you stop, and I couldn't get over to the left. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to hit him, right? I was that guy. I mean, just come on. Doesn't take much injustice to set us off, does it? I mean, I described that scenario to you. We instantly recognize that guy did the wrong thing. And there was no police officer to help him understand he did the wrong thing. And there's no amount of gesturing or getting on the CB radio and yelling at him. There's no amount of that that's going to make up for the injustice of that kind of thing. And so when you're a truck driver, you kind of learn to get used to it, and you kind of learn, okay, you got to let it go. Take a deep breath, just let it go. Because it happens all the time. Injustice happens all the time. And what do you do when it's a big injustice? What do we do as people when people are hurt? How do we deal with that? Injustice. Especially with smart people. The purpose of this series, what we're trying to do is to help you read the Bible more carefully. And so we've gone through a number of different literary genres, right? We've talked about wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is that good advice that comes from God, the kind of thing that your grandmother told you, or your grandfather, measure twice, cut once, those kind of things that you learn from hard experience. We talked about legal literature, where the Bible gives laws to govern the relationship between the Almighty God and the people of Israel. And we have to be very careful when we make application for that. Otherwise, we're going to have to start burning sheep somewhere. Not here, because I'm not a priest and we're not Jewish, right? We talked about legal literature. We talked about narrative literature, when God tells us stories. We use the book of Ruth to talk about God's stories, when He gives us characters and people to resonate and connect with. Last week we talked about prophecy. And prophecy warns of coming judgment for wrongdoing. The intent of prophecy is to help people and nations who are going the wrong direction, who are about to experience the justice, really, or the correction of God, the discipline of God. It says, hey, turn around and go the right way. Follow what you know to be right. And so prophecy says, get straight. We're going to make a distinction today between prophecy and apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is a kind of literature that you find in Daniel and Revelation. It's some of our favorite literature to go to when we say, there's black helicopters coming. You can find them in Revelation. Well, yeah, if you're a very creative interpreter, you can find all kinds of things in Revelation because it's a little bit of an odd duck, isn't it? And so, even the great reformer John Calvin looked at Revelation. He wrote commentaries on almost everything in the Bible. He looks at Revelation and he's like, pass. For good reason, right? It's difficult. The language is extremely symbolic. And so interpreters for centuries have wondered, what do these symbols mean? They've struggled to find the exact reference to those symbols. So apocalyptic is similar to prophecy, but apocalyptic has a very specific purpose. You see, apocalyptic speaks to the people who are undergoing persecution, to the people who are experiencing danger and death and hardship. And it says God's going to win in the end. That's the big purpose of apocalyptic, is to comfort people who are afflicted. It's been said that prophets afflict the comfortable, while apocalypticists comfort the afflicted. That's good stuff, isn't it? Last week was a heavy sermon, right? Judgment is coming. God says to people, I will crush you. That's heavy stuff. What about when you're the ones being crushed? This is the word of God for those people, for us, when we are in that situation. So last week we talked about the Babylonian captivity as predicted by Amos. And the captivity came to pass in 2 Kings chapter 25. And so let's back up a little bit and just remember King David, right? Remember King David? Sort of the height of Israel, okay? You've got David as the king. He is a good king. Okay, on balance, he's a good king. He gets the nation sort of expanded and consolidated, hands it over to his son Solomon, who says, we're going to build a temple for God. And so Solomon increases taxation, builds this marvelous temple, hands the kingdom over to his son Rehoboam. The people ask Rehoboam, hey, can we please have less taxes? And he says no. Kind of the way governments work. You know, when you ask for less taxes, they say no. Oh, sorry, the government's listening. There goes our tax exemption, I guess. And so Rehoboam's attitude towards the people splits the kingdom. So you have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Both are populated by the Jewish tribes. And in the nation of Judah, that's where the city of Jerusalem is. The surrounding nations, so what Amos points out is he goes through all of the surrounding nations and he points out their idolatry. And the idolatry the idols that they worshipped were characterized by brutality and immorality. This worship sort of seeps into the Jewish people. And so where they're supposed to have a pure worship of the one true God, they're actually full of idols. Now, as time goes by, some kings of Israel and Judah come in and they try to make reforms. They try to say, hey, we need to get rid of the idols. And more or less they do that. But then you have other kings who come along and they promote idolatry. And so the prophecy of Amos warns both Judah and Israel, because the law says you shall have no other gods before me. And Amos in chapter 2 says, for 3 sins of Judah, even for 4, I will not relent, because they have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his decrees, because they have been led astray by false gods, the gods their ancestors followed. I will send fire on Judah that will consume the fortresses of Jerusalem. And so Amos prophesies that judgment is coming. This happened in the form of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, where at first the nation of Assyria is ascendant. They're over 1,000 miles away. And so Assyria is trying to dominate the world. The Jewish people are charge of the world, Israel and Judah. So Assyria comes over and takes Israel captive. This happens in 722 BC. The Assyrians themselves were overthrown by the Babylonians, because that's the way politics worked in the ancient world. And the Babylonians then conquered the southern kingdom of Judah in 597 BC. And so the Babylonian captivity sort of took place in stages. At first, Judah was a vassal of Babylon. And so as a vassal, they were responsible to pay an annual tribute. Hi, thanks for not crushing us, here's your money. And then they also would send some of the children of the nobility back to Babylon. Now imagine this. How are you going to rebel against a foreign oppressor if your children are there? Because what would happen is that the Babylonians could just kill your kids. So you're less likely to start a rebellion if it endangers your children. So Judah is a vassal state to Babylon. They took some vessels from the temple and placed them in the temple of the Babylonian gods. How does that make you feel? Kind of oppressive, isn't it? It's kind of heavy. The Babylonians wanted to train the children that they took. They wanted to take them back to Babylon and make them into good Babylonians, right? Because then you could send Jewish Babylonian people back to help manage the country of Israel. Daniel is one of the people who gets caught up in this deportation. He's been sent to the Babylonian Empire to be Babylonianized. in the King's Re-Education Program. So we'll look at some sections of Daniel and Revelation today. Take a look with me, if you would please, at Daniel chapter 1. So Daniel is a captive. He's been taken from Israel, deported to Babylon, enrolled in the king's program. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them in the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. That's commitment, folks. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Daniel is going to have a long career in the foreign country of Babylon. And what happens to Daniel, Daniel's attitude is one of faithfulness and commitment to the one true God. You see, he's been put into this re-education program intended to make him a pagan, intended to break his religion and his person down to nothing and rebuild him in the image of Babylon. He refuses to do it. The beginning of Daniel is a historical narrative. It sets the scene for all the people living in captivity. Hey, be like Daniel. Don't Babylonianize. And God will watch out for you. Stay faithful. As the Babylonians took people in waves and marched them 1,000 miles away from home, Daniel's been enrolled in Babylonian college. He studies Babylonian history, he studies Babylonian paganism, he studies their language. Their language is Akkadian. It's the triangles pushed into clay, that stuff that's like, oh, wow, I don't want to learn that. Yeah. That's what he had to learn. And he only had 3 years to do it. To master a foreign language, to master a foreign culture. Daniel is young and taken away from his family. Now, normally in Daniel's culture, we've talked a lot about how Israelite culture valued the family, and how you would live in the Beth Av, the house of your father, where you would be in the same, really community with your grandfather, maybe even your great-grandfather. Daniel, as a young man, has been taken away from all of that. He's completely alone. How would you feel in that situation? Removed from everything that you've ever known and forced to learn something very, very different. And he's completely dependent on the Babylonians for his food and his shelter. The Babylonians put Daniel in this high-stress environment designed to break him down, specifically to destroy the way he views the world and then rebuild it. I love the way it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Who would you trust to sustain you if you were the captive? How would you do if you were there? And the choice is vegetables or steak. I love you, Lord. Daniel and his companions are to be an example. And throughout the book of Daniel, what you really see and what you really feel is God working behind the scenes. That the Jewish youths are allowed to eat vegetables and water. And that God provides them that they look healthier than the other people. And God gives them the ability to master the Babylonian curriculum so that they're far above and better than anybody else. And throughout Daniel, you see the hand of God. Now, they're there because of judgment. But these are the faithful. These are the people who have decided to get rid of paganism and follow the one true God exclusively, no matter what. And God honors them over and over and over through the book of Daniel. Daniel's in a pressure cooker. Now, I had to look all of this up. A pressure cooker uses pressure to cook food more quickly than other methods. Thanks, Captain Obvious. And apparently, it's different because the pressure inside the pot forces hot water into the food and allows for higher cooking temperatures. So the tough food that you're trying to cook comes out more tender. The same thing's true in an educational environment. I used to teach at a small Bible college, and what I would tell my students right at the beginning of the semester, hi, welcome to class, I'm going to crush you. In Christian love, of course. No, I would say this is a very difficult course, and so if you're going to get an A at the other end of this course, you're really going to have to bear down and work hard because, freshman college students don't. I mean, they just go goof off, unless you threaten them with you're going to get a D minus if you don't really bring your A game. And what happens is that the students kind of, they rise to the occasion. You set the bar high, your students will rise to meet it. Most of them. The right kind of pressure brings out the best. Extreme pressure, the kind of pressure that Daniel is under, is intended to destroy his relationship with God and replace it with paganism. He's being crushed. He's in the pressure cooker. You know what? In a lot of ways, so are we. Who will you trust when you're isolated and broken down? I mean, we know the right answer. We're supposed to trust God, but the reality of it is, when the heat gets turned up, we crack. Because we're very human. The Bible talks about the three areas where we fall into wrongdoing, where we fall into sin, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We fall into sex, stuff, and self. That's who we are. Those are our weaknesses. Those are the areas where we will just fall. And so we need God's strength. We need to depend on God's strength. My grandson likes to watch TV. He's had a hard day at kindergarten. He comes home. He needs to unwind. And so he just veges out. I mean, he just completely... And that's okay for a while. He's had a tough day. He's doing well in school. And every time, what happens when you're watching cartoons, guys? Commercials. You got 5 minutes of cartoon, 5 minutes of commercials. What does a 5-year-old do every time he sees a commercial, knowing that Christmas is just on the horizon? I want that. I want that on my Christmas list. I want that on my Christmas list. I want that on my... He's talking to himself. He doesn't... Do we even have a written list?
Not yet.
No. It's full.
I've lost track.
Yeah, it's full. And you know what's happening? Culture is trying to trick him into being a consumer. It's trying to say, your happiness comes from getting the next thing. That's us too. We do that. Well, so your Christmas then. And so what I've tried to do with Ezekiel, I've tried to say, look, stuff is fine, but it's to be used. It's not the source of your happiness. And I've tried to say, what are you going to give for Christmas? What are you going to give away? What are you going to do? How are you going to help other people? Unfortunately, I don't have as much time as the television does to get him excited about stuff. We avoid lust of the eyes by not getting too attached to our stuff. You can't take it with you. You just get to use it for a while. Daniel's big temptation is the pride of life, the self. Hey, Daniel, take care of yourself. You're at the top of your class. You're at the elite among the elite. You could get every kind of food that you wanted. You could feed yourself well, Daniel. Just go with what the Babylonians want. Daniel says no. He will not defile himself with the king's word. He will not give in to the pride of life. Rather than self, how do we serve other people? You know, we have an active visitation ministry. The folks that we visit at home would love to see you. They do love to see you. And you would be surprised at how blessed you'll be by going to see some of these folks. We're getting ready for Christmas season where we do Christmas carols for our shut-ins and for folks that can't get out. We have people who visit at the John George home. There are a lot of things going on. Daniel is the example for the Jewish people carried off to Babylon. Trust God. In the midst of this high-pressure environment where they want you to be a Babylonian, trust God and don't fall for what they're selling. Seek to do what's right, especially in captivity. Now, Daniel has this long career during captivity. He starts as a young man, ends as an old man. I don't think he ever makes it back to the promised land. But he serves God through all of his life there, and he is especially gifted at receiving and understanding visions from God. And he sees some weird stuff. So let's take a look at Daniel chapter 7. Daniel receives a vision and keeps trusting the Lord. This is the first 14 verses. In the first year of Belteshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions pass through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven turning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground, so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, get up and eat your fill of flesh. After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch. Because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there was before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. We didn't discover drugs. And I'm not saying that Daniel didn't either. This is really kind of out there, right? This is like, what are you talking about, Daniel? What's going on here? And this is apocalyptic literature, so you would expect, okay, you expect things that are larger than life, you expect things that are terrifying. And so what Daniel is relaying is a terrifying vision. Now some interpreters would read Daniel 7 with a newspaper open beside them. And they come up with some questionable interpretations from a futurist perspective. They believe that details of Daniel can fit into the modern world. Now, I'm not saying that these people are not Christians. They are Christians. They are our brothers and sisters. And you can believe these things and still go to heaven. These interpreters suggest that the lion is Great Britain. And the wings of an eagle are the United States. The bear, of course, is the Soviet Union or Russia. And this kind of breaks down when you get to the leopard. What's the leopard? One website I consulted just to make sure. This is the futurist perspective. But they suggest that it relates to modern Germany because the German main battle tank is called a leopard. In my opinion, they're reaching. They're reading the newspaper and the Bible at the same time, and they're reaching to find the correct interpretation. A better perspective looks into history to see if there are any historical nations that might fit better, and there are. This is called the preterist perspective. So the futurist perspective says all this stuff that's happening in Daniel, you have to keep looking into the future to find it. The preterist perspective says, wait, this happened in the past. So let's look into the past. Now, most of the time, these two views work really well together, where we start with the past and understand there is a future dimension to what's coming here. You can be a Christian and be either, and because good Christians disagree, you shouldn't insist that your interpretation is right and others are wrong. So it's important to remember that apocalyptic literature is very highly symbolic, and understanding symbols can be different. It's intended to be shocking. The four beasts that Daniel describes fit easily into the world that Daniel lives in. The first thing that we have to think about is the sea. The wind whips up the sea, and so there's this chaotic vision of the sea being very torn up. The sea is chaos. And so chaos is the place where the monsters come from. And Daniel would be familiar. See, this is ancient art from the Babylonian region. And what do you see? It's either a lion, tiger thing with wings. So these images aren't completely foreign to Daniel. He sees these kinds of things as he's walking around in Babylon. The lion with eagle's wings is familiar in Babylonian art and is symbolic of the Babylonian Empire, which was replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire during Daniel's lifetime, the bear eating the ribs. The leopard refers to the Greek conquest of Alexander the Great. This happens in future history from Daniel's time, which was split 4 ways after his death. The terrible beast with horns likely refers to the Roman Empire, and the little horn, so there's a transition of, between the Greeks and the Romans. The little horn is often referred to as, or refers to Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Antiochus was bad. He was boastful. His name means God manifest. And so he's walking around asking people to call him a vision of God. Whether you take a preterist view, a futurist view, or combine the two, the point to Daniel's original audience is this. There are terrifying forces at work in the world to crush and persecute the people of God. And these terrifying nations have this vision of the symbolic vision of being beasts who are here to crush the Christians, or the Old Testament saints, the Jewish people. They're unstoppable by ordinary means. The little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes, is bad. He's arrogant and dangerous. He's particularly notorious for his mistreatment of the Jewish people. from Daniel's time, people come back to the lands of Israel. They rebuild the city of Jerusalem. They rebuild the wall. And then the Greeks eventually take over. Antiochus comes on the scene and he says, hey, nice temple. We're going to set up a big statue of Zeus, the chief of the Greek gods, right here. And I like your altar. We're going to sacrifice some pigs on your altar. How do the Jewish people respond? They respond. It kicks off the Maccabean revolt. So they rebel, and Antiochus is like, thanks for rebelling. He begins crushing people, and he kills thousands and thousands of Jews. One story recorded in the Maccabees tells about how the troops came into one city, and they were trying to get people to eat pig's flesh. Hey, eat this pork. And all the Jews would refuse. And so one woman, she had 7 sons, and they killed all of her sons from the oldest to the youngest. And so the book of Maccabees just records this incredible persecution, this incredible, boastful little horn destroying Jewish people. What is the purpose of apocalyptic literature? It's to comfort you in the midst of intense persecution when you cannot do anything about it. Where is their hope for the people of God? How can they and we be like Daniel in the face of such horrible oppression? Daniel wants people to hold, in the face of oppression, to hold on for the ultimate judgment of God, symbolized by the Ancient of Days. And so the Ancient of Days is a vision of God sitting in judgment. There are phrases in here that say the books were opened, the courts were seated, thrones were set up. This is a setting of judgment. And who's being judged? The persecutors of the Jewish people. His hair and his clothing are symbolic of purity. The flames are symbols of judgment. We saw that in prophecy. What did Amos say? We're going to burn down your cities. God's throne is full of flames. The court was seated and the books were opened. The boastful horn is still speaking as the terrible beast is slain by the power of God and thrown into the fire. What does apocalyptic vindication looks like? It's when you're being crushed by a power you can't stop, and God intervenes. How many times in history have Christians been persecuted and crushed? There have been religious wars, persecutions, genocide. Some of them are ongoing. What do you say to people when it's not going to be okay? Will there be justice? That's the point of Daniel's vision. That there will be justice. The Son of Man is a picture of Christ. Note that he receives worship from all of the peoples as he establishes an everlasting kingdom. And see, here's where the historical vision of how to understand Daniel in the future work together. Is the reign of Christ yet future? It is. Is the cessation of persecution still future? It is. But when it comes, the persecuted will be comforted. The people who have been crushed will be restored by God's power. What's the point? When the people of God are suffering oppression, there is a judgment coming for the oppressors. There is vindication and comfort coming for the faithful who are being oppressed. So keep being faithful, no matter what. Keep trusting God. One of my favorite movies, Saving Private Ryan, one of the closing scenes is Captain John Miller. He's mortally wounded. They've been tasked, hey, protect this bridge at all costs. And so they're there protecting the bridge, and John Miller's been shot, and so he's leaned up against a jeep, and all he has is his pistol. And here comes a tank. And so he just starts shooting the pistol at the tank. Well, there's no point, except to be just defiant. And then all of a sudden the tank explodes. Not because it was shot by a guy with a pistol, but because at that moment reinforcements arrive. And the reinforcements come in and they drop bombs on the tank and the day is saved, and it works great in the movies. It doesn't always work like that in real life. Sometimes there isn't immediate vindication. Sometimes it waits. But it will happen. Our Christian brothers and sisters are experiencing persecution. Many are dying and many are suffering. Apocalyptic is a comforting word from God to them. Police in Thailand, this is from the Voice of the Martyrs. Police in Thailand have forbidden Christian worship and asked Christians to renounce their faith because too many people are becoming Christians. Let's have that problem. Christians in Eritrea, part of Africa, face economic pressures. There are many people in prison, leaving many Christian children without someone to take care of them. People in India have to read their Bibles in secret for fear that they will be beaten by family members. What does the Bible say when it won't be all right? That's what Apocalyptic is for. It acknowledges that we face terrible beasts in the form of governments, in the form of persecutions that we can't stop. And when it won't be all right, God is coming. And God will provide comfort to those who've been persecuted. So prophecy promises judgment for wrongdoing. Apocalyptic promises comfort for those who are afflicted and powerless. Take a look at the book of Revelation, chapter 21. This is John's apocalyptic vision, the final judgment. So stay hopeful. 21 verse 1. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and He will dwell with them. They will be His people. God Himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Then He said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." He said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God. They will be my children. But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, and those who practice magic arts, the idolaters and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur. This is the second death. The book of Revelation is a book of mixed genres. There are several different kinds of literature here. Some of it is an epistle. Some of it is written as a letter to the churches. That's right up at the front. Others calls itself a prophecy. And yet the name of the book is an apocalypse. And remember, an apocalypse is intended to provide comfort for people who are undergoing persecution. This is the book that John Calvin wasn't sure what to do with. And so he very wisely did nothing with it. When we think about apocalyptic, a text on biblical interpretation says this: elaborate and sometimes bizarre symbolism depicts past, present, and future events in a way that requires a careful decoding of the elements of the text. Battles between the forces of good and evil often appear, with the good eventually triumphing. One of the primary purposes of Apocalypse, therefore, is to encourage a beleaguered religious community in times of oppression or persecution. In the modern world, many interpreters have the luxury of worrying about the details. But the details can be pushed too far, and so we need to be careful with them. The big point is that when people are being crushed by persecution, God is going to come. God is going to provide vindication. God is going to provide the comfort. John wrote the book of Revelation at the end of his life. The temple has been destroyed. There's sporadic persecution against Christians by the Romans and the Jews. All of the apostles, except John, have been violently killed. Is it going to be okay? Eventually. John's vision suggests that the key to living in the face of persecution is to place your hope in God's restoration of everything. Isn't it interesting to notice there was no longer any sea right at the beginning of this text in Revelation? You know why? There's no more chaos. God has solved the problem of chaos. Where are the monsters going to come from if there's no sea? Nowhere. Because God is going to have everything in perfect control and in perfect order. The New Jerusalem is considered often a personification of the people of God who will live in a restored relationship with Him, prepared as a bride on her wedding day, to live with God forever, to be comforted by God eternally. It's like the Garden of Eden, broken in Genesis, is restored at the end of time. He'll wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying in pain. This was written to a persecuted church, where children have been separated or enslaved from their families, where whole families have been destroyed by violent persecution. The water without cost is a picture of salvation, that the people of God will have every need supplied. And in the middle of this comfort, there's justice. The oppressors will be cast into a lake of fire. The oppressed will be comforted by God Himself. Apocalyptic literature reminds Christians that it might not be okay in the here and now, but that ultimately God will provide judgment for the persecutors, justice and comfort for the persecuted. Often we misread the details and lose the point. What happens when injustice goes beyond getting cut off in traffic? When you or your family is subjected to actual suffering and there's no one to call. We expect the police to show up when we call. There's times when we don't. We expect someone to come and solve this persecution problem, but there are sometimes it's the government that is the problem. It's happening for churches throughout the Middle East. Our brothers and sisters in Christ are undergoing persecution right now by governments. What does Apocalyptic teach when it's not going to be okay? It teaches us that God will have final, complete vindication. And that we as His followers, as His faithful followers, like Daniel, under a pressure, staying faithful, staying hopeful, we will experience the comfort of God. So what should we think, believe, or do when we read apocalyptic literature, things like Daniel and Revelation? By all means, have friendly discussions about the details. Where yourselves are. Find black helicopters. It's okay. There are people out there who read it with the newspaper, and they're good people. But also, I think, read it with the history books open as well. So that when we talk about the details, we can say, okay, yes, now, but also then. So that we're thinking historically and carefully. Don't push the details beyond what the author intends. That would lead us to misreading the Bible. We don't want to do that. Remember that it's written to people who are suffering persecution. And use the idea of God's justice and comfort for people who suffer now. Have you been wronged? I know a little bit about most of them. And I know you've been wrong. God will provide vindication. God will provide comfort. Read the Bible carefully, thoughtfully. Share the apocalyptic with people when it's not okay, so that we can stay faithful and keep trusting and stay hopeful. As the praise team comes back up, and as the guys get ready to collect the offering, Father, I thank you that you've given us ultimate vindication. That you've given us a sure and certain knowledge, Lord, that when it's not okay here now, that you haven't gone off the throne. That you see and hear the suffering of the people. Father, we are blessed to be in a country where we don't suffer. Where we aren't suffering, where we're not persecuted. Not in a real way. So Lord, I pray that you help us to think about the persecuted church. Think about our brothers and sisters as if they were our brothers and sisters who are suffering and struggling among them. And so, Lord, I pray that you hear their cries. I pray, Lord, that you enter in, Lord. I pray that you help them physically and here and now, Lord. But I also trust you, Father, for knowing that ultimately nobody's going to get away with harming your people. And so, Lord, help our brothers and sisters experiencing persecution, feel that, in a very real way. Father, we rejoice in who you are and what you've done for us, Lord. Bless this offering. Use it for your needs here in this body. And Lord, help us to do what's right in Christ's name.
Sing about the chain breaker that we have in Christ. So if you And stand if you're able. We're going to close out. If you've been walking the same old road for miles and miles, if you've been hearing the same old voice tell the same old lies, if you're trying to fill the same old holes inside, there's a better life. There's a better life. If you've got pain, he's a pain taker. If you feel lost, he's a way maker. If you need freedom or saving, he's a prison shaking savior. If you've got chains, he's a chain breaker. We've all searched for the light of day in the dead of night. We've all found ourselves worn out from the same old fight. We've all run to things we know just ain't right. When there's a better life, there's a better life. If you've got pain, he's a pain taker. If you feel lost, he's a way maker. If you need freedom or saving, he's a prison shaking savior. If you got chains, he's a chain breaker. If you believe it, if you receive it, if you can feel it, somebody testify. If you believe it, if you believe it, if you receive it, if you can feel it, somebody testify. I'm gonna testify. If you believe it, if you receive it, if you can feel it, somebody testify. If you got pain, he's a pain taker. If you feel lost, he's a way maker. If you need freedom or saving, he's a prison shaking savior. If you got chains, he's a chain breaker. If you need freedom or saving, he's a prison shaking savior. If you got chains, he's a chain breaker. Father God, thank you so much for hope. That the wrongs of this world will be righted, Lord. That if we hold on to you, we'll be taken care of, Lord. That we'll see glory someday. God, I'm so thankful that I can cast all my cares on you. I pray that people everywhere will know you as their Savior. Send us out. Let us carry your good word with us. It's in your Son, Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You guys are dismissed.